At 4:12 a.m. on September 19, 1944, the fog over the Moselle River was less of a weather pattern and more of a suffocating shroud. Inside a fortified stone farmhouse on the outskirts of Metz, Oberleutnant Hans Kraus of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division poured a cup of lukewarm chicory coffee. He felt untouchable behind 3-foot-thick medieval masonry. He had 2 MG-42s crossing their fire over the only approach road, and 40 battle-hardened men who had survived the retreat from Normandy. To Kraus, the Americans were a spent force, stalled by the autumn mud and the iron geography of the Rhine. Kraus didn't just feel safe, he felt bored. The fog was a white wall that hid his own mortality. He checked his Luger, a polished relic of a war he thought he was winning. In the next 90 seconds, his reality would shatter. Across the field, huddled in a freezing drainage ditch choked with dead leaves and the stench of stagnant water, sat Corporal Victor Miller. He wasn't holding a Garand or a Thompson submachine gun. He was clutching the cold brass knobs of a heavy experimental wire recorder. This was the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the Ghost Army. Miller was about to engage in a form of psychological warfare that flipped military doctrine on its head. What he was about to do was explicitly forbidden by high command. The brass feared that drawing the enemy's heaviest fire with parlor tricks would lead to the senseless slaughter of specialized technicians. Before the draft board sent him a letter, Victor Miller didn't know a thing about ballistics or small unit tactics, but he knew everything about the anatomy of a signal. He was a sound technician for a local radio station in the industrial soot of Pittsburgh. He spent his 1930s in cramped recording booths, learning how to layer tracks, how to mask background hiss, and how to make a single voice sound like a stadium-filling crowd through the clever use of room tone. He spent years in the basement of KDKA, obsessing over the hum of city wires and the resonance of steel. His gear wasn't weapons, it was 500-pound amplifiers and fragile glass-encased vacuum tubes. He understood the physics of acoustics, how sound waves bounced off cold brick versus how they died in the soft, wet mud. When he enlisted, his instructors at Fort Meade were visibly baffled by his records. They saw a man who obsessed over gain and frequency instead of grouping his shots at the range. They mocked his gramophone and his crates of heavy, fragile speakers, calling his unit a traveling circus that would vanish the moment a real Panzer IV showed its face. They missed the potential of a man who could manufacture a battlefield out of thin air. The tactical problem was a meat grinder known as the Metz Gap. The Germans held a ridge commanding the entire valley, and standard army doctrine, the rigid West Point way, dictated a massive artillery barrage, followed by a frontal infantry assault across open ground. Sterling was a man of ink and paper, a strategist who saw men as numbers on a ledger. Santino's sister had just sent him a photograph of her first swimming trophy, a photo now soaked in river mud. The official methods had already filled the local field hospitals. Private Leo Santino, 19, from Philadelphia. He was a champion high school swimmer who had a 6-year-old sister waiting for him to come home and teach her the backstroke. He was caught in the open and died in the first 3 minutes of the assault. Sergeant Bill Graham, 24, from a dairy farm in Ohio. He had a scholarship to Ohio State waiting for him. He was cut down by Kraus's MG-42 while trying to flank the farmhouse through a hedge that offered no real cover. Despite the mounting body count, Major Sterling, his uniform pressed and his boots gleaming, refused to deviate from the field manual. "We do not win wars with record players, Corporal," he had barked at Miller. "We win them with lead. You will stay in the rear, or I'll have you court-martialed for obstructing a live operation." Miller, watching through binoculars from the tree line, noticed a tiny flaw the strategists had missed. The valley wasn't just a killing field, it was a natural parabolic reflector. He calculated that the limestone cliffs behind the German position would amplify any sound coming from the southern woods. Miller realized the limestone wasn't a barrier, it was a megaphone. While the major studied topo maps, Miller studied the reverberation of his own footsteps. He knew this unauthorized trick was his only ticket home. If he positioned his speakers at exactly 22 degrees upward, the sound would bounce off the rock and hit the farmhouse from the rear. It would make it seem like a massive armored pincer was closing in from the enemy's own flank. Miller presented his plan, a sonic diversion to trick Krauss into believing he was being encircled by the 4th Armored Division. The major laughed in his face. He threatened Miller with a court-martial for unauthorized field modifications to the mission parameters. Miller didn't argue. He waited until the major moved to the command tent to report the inevitable failure of the next infantry wave, and then Miller went rogue. He stole a Willys Jeep, loaded his 500-pound speakers, and drove toward the no man's land in total silence, with zero support and the knowledge that his own side might shoot him for desertion. The air smelled of fermented corn from a nearby silo and the sharp metallic tang of ozone. Miller's palms were slick with sweat that soaked through his wool uniform. He positioned the speakers at the calculated 22-degree angle, exactly 480 yards from the German farmhouse. The sound didn't just hit the ears, it rattled the Germans' rib cages. Krauss watched his men scramble, their professional training useless against a phantom. The sonic geometry was perfect. The farmhouse shook under the weight of ghosts. He checked his levels. The wire recorder was set. The silence of the morning was absolute. Miller exhaled halfway, held his breath, and flipped the toggle. The sound was a physical blow. The recording, a symphony of churning tank treads, the high-pitched whine of Sherman engines, and the rhythmic clank-clank of heavy treads on gravel, roared at 110 decibels. Miller layered in the infantry track, hundreds of men screaming orders, and the sound of heavy boots hitting the road. To Oberlieutenant Krauss, the world had suddenly filled with steel. He didn't see tanks, but the anatomy of the sound told his brain they were inches away in the fog. He heard the clanging of tank hatches, a specific sound Miller had recorded by hitting a crowbar against a boiler. "Panzer! Panzer!" the Germans screamed. The farmhouse erupted in panic. Krauss, believing his unit was seconds away from being crushed by a non-existent armored battalion, did the only thing a professional soldier could do when faced with overwhelming force. He ordered his men to cease fire and burn their codebooks. By 6 a.m., 42 German soldiers, including Oberleutnant Krauss, walked out of the farmhouse with their hands behind their heads. They surrendered to Victor Miller, a lone corporal standing next to a humming speaker and a pile of batteries. 0 American lives were lost in the final takeover of the Metz Gap. He walked into his old station, hung up his uniform, and never mentioned the 42 men who owed him their lives. To the world, he was a technician. To history, he was a silent architect of victory. The army eventually realized the power of the Ghost Army and incorporated sonic deception into official doctrine, but they never gave Victor Miller a medal. His actions were classified top secret for 50 years, ensuring the technique remained a mystery. When the war ended, Miller didn't ask for recognition. He returned to the gray skies of Pittsburgh. He went back to the radio station, fixing broken tubes and adjusting the gain on local broadcasts. He never talked about the morning he conquered a battalion with a gramophone. He had a life to rebuild. To his neighbors, he was just a man who knew how to fix a radio. To 42 Germans, he was the ghost that had outsmarted the machine of war. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories.